And so on Thursday morning, we started with Alan Webster, who is the producer and the one who writes all the tracks that are associated with House to House, Heart to Heart. So Alan Webster spoke, and then we had to listen to Hiram Kemp. That was pretty painful. No, and then we had Vestal after that, and so then we had B.J. Clark after that, and so that was just the way the day went. So that was a pretty good day, and so we enjoyed our time, but glad to be home. And those of you who are familiar with the sound of my voice, you can tell that I brought a little bit of Central Texas allergies back with me and combined them with East Texas allergies. So we'll just do what we can and do the best we can. All right, Lamentations chapter 3. And we were in the section talking about Jeremiah chapter 3, beginning in verse 48 and going through 58. And Jeremiah is going to be talking about the growth, and throughout this chapter he's talking about the causes and the concerns, what all befell the Jews as they were carried away into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar and his army, and the reasons behind all of that. And so we're kind of dealing with, as the book indicates, the tears of Jeremiah. And so in verse 49, if you would notice, he says, "My eyes flow and do not cease without interruption." Jeremiah was shedding tears, and consistently and incessantly he was shedding tears on behalf of the citizenry and the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Now he says, "My eyes flow and they're not going to cease till the Lord from heaven looks down and sees." Now, the reality is God sees what? Everything. Our life is an open book before Him. Everything we say, everything we do, every thought that we possess, everything that transpires, it is certainly known before Him, and nothing is hidden from His sight. So this is not the reality that God is unaware, but what He's really petitioning is He's wanting God to intervene, to turn the tide of things as it has been brought upon the citizenry of Jerusalem and Judah. So now, till the Lord from heaven looks down and sees, my eyes bring suffering to my soul because of all the daughters of my city. Now, we noticed it last time, but what were a lot of the women having to do? Yeah. Well, if you just look at Jeremiah's activity, he was there for 40 plus years, just one man. And that's not talking about all the others that were before him. Of course, when you look at Isaiah, even though he has messages that come down and address Judah, his main import is the northern kingdom. But still, even through Isaiah, which is, what did we put him 150 years ahead of Jeremiah? Then we're looking at Isaiah's message as it starts, and then he carries that on down. And so God has been trying to turn these people for years and years and years. And Jeremiah, as we noticed even last week, he was one who was mistreated. He was shamefully treated by these folks. And so when we think about Jeremiah and his work, he is crying for these folks, longing for them, and he wants what's best for them. And in that way, and even we brought up the last time we were together discussing this, in this same idea that Jeremiah is expressing for Judah, then we come down to the Apostle Paul, and what does he do for the Jews? Yeah. I mean, you can't help but read the opening verses of Romans 9 and Romans chapter 10, and Paul just clearly states, he says, if it were possible, if my kinsman, my Jewish kinsman, could be saved, I'd be willing to be what? Lost, anathema, devoted to destruction. And that word anathema is a strong, strong word. And so he says, that's what I wish would be done. And the reason that they were in that plight, the Jews of Paul's day, is he says, I bear them record, they have a zeal for God. Now I want you to just circle that thought in your mind. One can be zealous and still be what? Wrong. They had a zeal for God. And for God, he says, I bear them record. They have a zeal for God. But being ignorant of God's righteousness, now what have they done? They've gone about to establish their own righteousness. So we have people that are zealous, people that are, I don't know if on fire would be the right word, but they are seeking to strive to be pleasing to God. And he says now they have a zeal, and yet they're wrong because they've not sought God's righteousness. And being ignorant of God's righteousness, they've gone about to establish their own. So as we think about Paul and we think about Jeremiah, we think about the situation that both of these men are identifying for us, it's no wonder, having the heart that they ought to have, that Jeremiah would say in verse 51, my eyes bring suffering to my soul because of all the daughters of my city. When Jeremiah saw the things that were taking place, all the events that were unfolding, and what three things that Jeremiah reminded them of over and over again through the book of Jeremiah, that Babylon's coming from the north. And there were three things that he kept bringing up. This is what you're going to endure. You're going to endure famine, pestilence, and the sword. And these phrases come up over and over and over again as Jeremiah is trying to turn them back to God himself. And so these three things now, as Jeremiah's there, and he's observing all of this, and he's seeing the famine. And the famine was so great in the land that, as we brought up last time, and Dale and them already mentioned, we see mothers having to do what with their children? To eat them. And now, they were doing that for their own survival. So how bleak and how desperate had things become? I mean, that is unimaginable in our mind to actually put your child to death and then to turn around and eat them for your own survival. That's an image that's one of those things, and I think, and some of you have referenced this and stuff. There are times when it's just very clear the Bible was very clinical, because the Bible doesn't go into any detail as to how all that transpired. I mean, we can't even imagine that in this day and time. And yet, not only were doing that because of famine, but now what about the pestilence, illness? The conditions were such that even Jeremiah, he's talking about when Babylon comes, when Nebuchadnezzar comes and his men and they start destroying the city, then the bodies are going to be stacked out like what? Cordwood. They were killing people left and right. And, the Babylonians didn't have any concerns about their loved ones and how they were caring for them even after their passing. So they're just stacking them out. Can you imagine the Well, I guess we can't because we haven't experienced that. And then you think about dying from disease, and then those that are put to death by the sword. And I mean, this is just absolute, I mean, it's unimaginable. Okay, go ahead, Stan. No. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 And I think, the blight of abortion in this country is going to go down in history as one of its greatest downfalls. And it's been going on since 1973. And, we're millions and millions and millions of babies have been put to death. And so Stan brings up a very valid point. Now, notice 52. My enemies without cause hunted me like a bird. Now, who were Jeremiah's enemies? Jews. It wasn't the Babylonians. I mean, when the Babylonians arrived, Jeremiah was treated more favorably by them than he was by his fellow countrymen. It was his own countrymen that, if they'd had their hand, they would have killed him if they could have gotten away with it. It was his own countrymen that put him in the pit. It was his own countrymen that treated him in ways that the Babylonians never attempted to do that. And so now he says, my enemies without cause hunted me down like a bird. Might ought to bring to our mind, you remember what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Galatians when he says, have I become your enemy because I told you the truth? And so my enemies without cause hunted me like a bird. They silenced my life in the pit and threw stones at me. The waters flowed over my head. I said, I am cut off. Verse 30, 54. 55, I called on your name, O Lord, from the lowest pit, and you have heard my voice. Do not hide your ear from my sighing, for my cry for help. You drew near on the day that I called on you and said, do not fear. O Lord, you have pleaded the cause for my soul. You have redeemed my life. So now notice Jeremiah, as we noticed before, leading up to verse 23, where it's talking about God's mercies and they're new every morning. And we noticed that context where it seemed like the verses just preceding that, Jeremiah was having a very low moment. And he was, perhaps his faith was starting to waver and he was starting to doubt. And so then he's reminded of God's faithfulness. Well, he reiterates that again. I cried out to you and you what? Heard. I cried out and you did not hide your ear from me. You drew near on the day that I called on you and said, do not fear. And notice, you have pleaded the case for my soul. You have redeemed my life. So Jeremiah, as he's bringing this section 48 through 58 to a close, he's reminding us that yes, things may seem very bleak. There may not be much hope. But then he's reminding us that if God is on your side, what do you have to fear? And what do you have? Romans 8, you get down into 31 and following. And Paul says, if God be for us, who can be against us? You remember when Jesus said to his disciples, fear not him who is able to kill the body, but fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. So now when we think about what Jeremiah is doing, he's reminding us of the faithfulness of our God. And what promise did God leave for us as Jesus was giving the Great Commission to the disciples? What did he leave them with? In the last part of that Matthew 28, 18 through 20 context, what does verse 20 say? I'm with you always. Now, knowing that is one thing, but living my life based on that knowledge, that's something totally different. I mean, we can have the head knowledge of that. If I were to start it, or even to ask some of you, what could we quote probably verbatim? Matthew 28, 18 through 20. We could quote that. But then we need to live with that assurance that verse 20 says, I'm with you always. And we go to Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6, where God makes the promises that he will, through the Hebrew writer, that he will never forsake us. He'll never abandon us. And like I said, head knowledge of that is one thing, but living that truth is something else, because that's where the proverbial rubber meets what? The road. Yeah. And so the Bible gives us ample information concerning the faithfulness of God.
That this day and time we can have a country just invaded us like Russia. And I thought we was above that.
Yeah.
But here's my point, is this. What have we learned? God didn't bring all of this on us. We did. God didn't bring the problems that we have in this country on us. We did.
Right.
God's going to be with us, those that are with him. And not everybody is with him.
No.
Yeah. So he doesn't cause, in a sense, he has given us, in this day and time, a way out of the problems that Jeremiah had, the Jews had. He's given us a way out of the problems that's in this world we see today, for there's something better. And I am thankful that I can look and see that there's something better.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Absolutely true. On God's side is to be against him. And Jesus, Matthew 12 and verse 30, he said, he that is not with me is against me. He that's not gathering is scattering abroad. So we want to always make sure we're maintaining allegiance to the right side. And so Jeremiah is just reminding us again of the faithfulness of God and how that he is going to be true to us, and he's going to do everything that he's promised that he will do. Verse 59, going through the third chapter. O Lord, you have seen how I am wronged. Judge my case. You have seen how I'm wronged. So Jeremiah at this point has put everything in whose hands? It's in God's hands. You've seen how wronged I have been. So judge my case. You have seen all their vengeance, all their schemes against me. Now we don't I mean, we get some insight into the things that Jeremiah endured through the book of Jeremiah, but there are some men and women, we won't exclude women from this, but there are some men and some women in this world, and they lie awake all night on their beds thinking of what? Ways I can wake up and sin tomorrow. They lie awake on their beds and they are wondering, how can I get something over on somebody? Or how can I get this, one further step up on somebody? There's all kinds of schemes that are being hatched out and brought out. And there's no telling what all Jeremiah had to deal with. Continually, yeah. And we go back to that Genesis 6 context, and absolutely. And that's why I've always thought, or not always, but in the last several years, I've thought when you get down to verse 8 of that Genesis chapter 6, and you have that statement of how bad the world is, but then it's like suddenly God just hit the brakes. And this is my way of looking at it. Now, whether it's absolutely the way it was or not, as God is surveying the whole world, He's got one thought. The thoughts and intents of men's heart are what? Evil. And all of a sudden, but there's Noah. I mean, it's like, oh, 100 plus years. Yeah, 100 plus years. Yeah, 120 years is pretty much where most people fall, that Noah was building and working and getting the ark ready. But when God was viewing things, and I mean, I think what we need to think about is, as God's viewing the landscape of the world today, when He gets to us, does He have that same thought? But insert your name. Would I be is my life in as stark a contrast to the world around us as Noah's was today? Should, and then that's the next question. If it's not, well, then should it be? Should my life be such a contrast that I would have God say the same thing about me in the world in which I live? But, wait a minute, look here. And you insert your name. And then go on and say, but what has this person found? What did Noah find? Grace in the eyes of the Lord. So, Noah was, I'm not going to say he's an unsung character, because I think if you go anywhere and you mention the ark, most people are going to say, yeah, Noah. He's not unsung, but he is one of those characters that when God was viewing the world, He stopped right there and He said, I got to pause here a minute. This is Noah. Yeah, and you go back to the 5th chapter. What did God do? He's naming all those folks and everything, but suddenly He stops in chapter 5 and He says, but Enoch. What did Enoch not do? Enoch didn't taste of death. God took him. Why? Enoch's character was such God wouldn't leave this world anymore. God took him. Well, God didn't take Noah, remove Noah from the world, but Noah gets highlighted. And then what does Noah do? What did Noah do? Did everything God commanded him to do. So even though the text tells us in verse 8 that Noah found grace or he found favor in the sight of the Lord, that grace or favor did not grant Noah what? Passage in and of itself into eternity in a saved state. Because very shortly what we're going to see where Noah is as human can be. Because he gets drunk and he gets his nakedness uncovered. What all that involves, I don't know, but we can be absolutely 100% sure of what all took place. But I do know that what did take place did not please whom? God. So Noah, he's as human can be. He wasn't a robot that God just wound up and he was going to do everything that pleased God all the time. And so there are things that, we need to take from these Old Testament lessons and individuals and their lives and consider how that applies to me and how I can apply it and how it can change me for the better. Eric?
Well, Jeremiah had a responsibility too, to speak.
Yeah.
God probably wouldn't have delivered him if he hadn't spoken or went where he told him to go. He had an obedience part of that as well, just like we do today.
Yes. Yeah. Go and speak. And yet, he told Jeremiah long before Jeremiah even started, he said, you go speak, but guess what? The people you're speaking to, they're not going to what? They're not going to listen. They're not going to listen. So, Jeremiah is one of those great characters of the Old Testament, and I think sometimes the length of Jeremiah runs us off from it. It's 52 chapters. And then if you tie onto that the sequel, the chapters that are found in the book of Lamentations, that we don't delve into these historical, as they're referred to, the major prophets, perhaps as we ought. We kind of get going through Jeremiah and then, well. And the thing about it is Jeremiah can be confusing because it's not chronological. And so you'll have events taking place and you kind of got to keep all that in mind. But still, there are such valuable truths to be gained from the book of Jeremiah.
Review this about the Jews, about a people. And we think it's a nation, and it was at that time. But what we have to do with is me.
Right.
That's what I have to do with is me. And we have church family, we have brothers and sisters all over the world, but still, if I'm going to get to heaven, I'm not going to get it on anybody's help or whatever it's going to do on me.
Right.
That's where we get the thing, because I come to services every time the door's open, that's all I need to do, but it's not.
No. That is true. So we need to all make examination of ourselves and knowing that God is going to be faithful, and Jeremiah proves that. So let's continue on here. Oh Lord, you have seen how I am wronged. Judge my case. You have seen all their vengeance, all their schemes against me. You have heard their reproach, O Lord, all their schemes against me. The lips of my enemies and their whispering against me all the day. Look at their sitting down and their rising up. I am their taunting song. So, Jeremiah is just calling upon God to observe everything that he's enduring and everything that's being done against him. And then he says, but I'm going to let you repay them. And that's really what we pick up in verse 64. Repay them, O Lord, And really what prefaces this is the understanding of two words. You will repay them. Remember what Paul wrote about vengeance? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Now, everything that God does and has done, how has He done it? Justly. How has He done it? Through other people. But God has carried out His plan. He's carried out His purpose, whether that be blessing or even punishment. God has carried that out, and He's carried it out perfectly. Perfectly. So now when Jeremiah says, you will repay them, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. You might think about Romans 14, verse 12, 2 Corinthians 5, and verse number 10, and other passages which talk about the fact that we're going to receive in our body the right judgment for the things we've done. God's going to do that. But you're going to repay them according to the work of their hands. Verse 65, you will give them a veiled heart. Your curse be upon them. You will, in your anger, pursue and destroy them from under the heavens of the Lord. So Jeremiah is confident that God is going to what? Vindicate him. Vindicate him in the sense that He's going to bring punishment upon the people of his day. You will do this. So I'm not concerning myself with getting what? Getting even. I'm not concerning myself with that. You're going to do it. And would we not have to admit that God could punish these people and will punish them in a way that is far better than we ever could or they ever could? So, as we think about God and we think about what Jeremiah is petitioning Him for, he is calling upon God to observe the people, to observe His righteous character, and then bring judgment upon them all. How? Accordingly. Chapter 4 now. Chapter 4, we revert back now to a 22-verse chapter. And chapter 5 is going to be 22 verses as well. And so we're going to see where he starts now again talking about how things are going to be brought out and how things have suddenly and how they have digressed, and really looking at the condition of things. So now we look at chapter 4, verse 1. How the gold has become dim, and how changed the fine gold. The stones of the sanctuary are scattered at the head of every street. The precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the work of the hands of the potter. Even the jackals present their breasts to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people is cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. Now, if you go back and you read Job chapter 39 or 38, whichever one it is, 14 through 17, there is statements there made about the ostrich. Why is it that the ostrich gets such a kind of a bad rap in Scripture? I mean, they're ugly as all get out, but I mean, I don't know that has anything to do with it. But 39, 13 going down through verse 17, he says, the wings of the ostrich, they wave proudly. But are her wings pinions like the kindly storks? She leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. So, the imagery we get of the ostrich is not one that's very flattering. Now, I know that there's probably some analogy, some comparison that's taking place in Job 39, but there has to be some truth to the ostrich and perhaps her mistreatment of her young. And so when we look here, he says, now you've become cruel like the ostrich in the wilderness. Now the tongue of the infant clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. So as we think about Jeremiah, as he's bringing up this thought of continuing to look at the fallout, I would say, from the things that have transpired. When you look at the first verse, what has happened? Can precious things become of little value? Yeah. And it's kind of like the story I heard Ken Hope tell years ago when we were at the Fort Worth lectures, and he was talking about the rich folks on the Titanic. And he was talking about how that, when it's fully aware and everybody knew that we've got to get off this ship or we're going to drown, and they were going to get in lifeboats and try to survive. Then they went back into their staterooms, and it's recorded historically for us that they stepped past furs and jewelry and those things. And what did they get? Anybody remember that? Apples and oranges and things they could survive on. I mean, if you're drowned at the bottom of the ocean, then what good were all those jewels? What good was all the furs that you'd brought on the ship? That wasn't any good at all. So they were stuffing their coats with all things they needed to survive, to feed themselves. And so I think the point of that story is, in a moment, the value of something can change just like that. And so they stepped around and stepped over and went beyond all of those valuable things that they had, and they wanted something that could provide for them the physical nourishment they were going to need. So the value of things changes in an instant. And the precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the work of the hands of the potter. Now, Dale brought up just a few moments ago about the Russian and the Ukrainian and all of those issues and stuff. And I don't know all of the reasons as to why Russia decided to invade the Ukraine. But I think it probably goes back to one simple thing: greed. When you look at the area of the Ukraine, from just what I've just seen, and like I said, I haven't made a thorough study of all of this, but I think compared to Russia and the Ukraine has much more valuable resources and everything in that area than what the area of Russia itself does. So we could be looking at something as simple as greed. Yeah. So it's just greed and pride and a host of other things. But we'll pick some of this up next time we meet. And thank you all for your comments.